Happy first day of fall, everyone, and welcome to my Ohio garden. It is dry here in Ohio, with temps 10 to 15 degrees above normal and severe drought conditions in most of the state. It continues to be a challenging garden season. I know that many of you fellow gardeners are in the same boat right now, so in today's video, I thought I would share an update of how my garden is faring in these drought conditions, as well as how garden cleanup and prep for next year is going to be a bit different this year because of the drought. Now today you'll see my garden is not nearly as full and lush as it would typically be this time of year. I've made the decision to pull a lot of my crops early, things that I had already gotten a good harvest off of and just weren't as productive anymore. So there's a lot of empty spaces out in the garden, and I planted fewer fall crops this year than normal. I've also been really selective with my watering. So you'll see out here that I'm really only focused on watering things in the front half of the garden. The back half of the garden hasn't gotten any supplemental irrigation at all this year. So let's have a look. Up in the front of the garden, things are doing okay. I still have a decent amount of green up here. I just finished clearing out some shell beans and planted this in cover crop mix. I've got it covered with shade cloth to help keep the soil cool while these seeds germinate and to prevent birds from eating up all the seed. I've got a few fall transplants under this netting. I don't normally net chard, but I had such issues with insect damage on my spring chard that I decided to protect it. Thanks to you fellow savvy gardeners, I think that I figured out the problem was with tarnished plant bug feeding, and the netting seems to be doing a great job preventing issues on these fall transplants. It's been an odd season here with insects and diseases I've not really dealt with before in Ohio. This arch is loaded with purple hyacinth bean pods right now. And over here is one of the plants I'm probably most excited about this season. This is red foliated white cotton, and the video doesn't really do justice to its color. I only did a small test plot here of a few plants, but if I can manage to actually get mature cotton bolls here in my climate, I may do a larger planting next year. I've also got loofah and moonflowers planted on this arch. Here's one of the larger loofah gourds. And from this angle, you can see the moonflower blooms still open here at about 8:30 in the morning. They're a night bloomer, so they usually start opening around dusk and will close up within about half an hour or so. The beds up here in front are primarily just volunteer flowers and herbs at this point, but the pollinating insects seem to be very grateful for this feast, so I'm just letting everything go at this point. I do still have some really nice basil in here, surprisingly. This one is from the Everleaf series of basil, and true to its name, it rarely bolts, even in this exceptional heat that we've been having. More morning glories here. When my cucumbers came down, I just wanted something really quick to climb up this arch so it wasn't bare, and these morning glories are doing the trick. Some Caribe type peppers here of the variety Yellowstone. These ripen from this kind of pale green to an orangey red. It's weird because many of my peppers seem to be very late to fully mature this year. Another new to me crop, this is tree tobacco grown from seed. Now it is a short-lived perennial in zones 8 and south, but here in zone 6, it unfortunately probably isn't even going to flower for me, let alone come back through the winter. In those southern zones, it can become invasive, and this is a highly toxic plant. But what intrigued me about this plant is its ability to inhibit the germination of other plant seeds through leachates from its dry leaves and twigs. I may play around with this as a form of weed control. My poor sunchokes along the fence look horrible. First, these got nailed with powdery mildew and then shriveled up in the drought. But I have complete faith they'll pop up anew next spring. They're an incredibly hardy plant. Back here, I'm working on clearing out beans. These are snap bush beans that I got multiple pickings off of and then left the rest to dry up to be collected for next year's seeds. Beans are one of my favorite crops to save seed from because they're super easy for beginners. The drought worked to my advantage here. These dried right down on the plant. I just harvested the pods and I'll pop those seeds out and store the seeds in glass mason jars till next year. If I can't get to the pods right away or they're still a bit wet, I just store them in my greenhouse till they're dry. Now here in the back corner of the garden, I'm working on digging a trench for another Hügelkultur bed. Now, if you've watched any of my older videos, you may know that I am a big fan of the Hügelkultur technique of building garden beds. But this is a very strategic move for me in this garden to help deal with weather events like this. Now, as much as I'd like to hope to the contrary, I don't necessarily foresee in the long term these challenging weather patterns improving. We will likely have years that are better or less challenging than others, but in general, I suspect that issues with drought and really warm spring and fall seasons here in Ohio are going to continue. So I am looking at ways to make my garden more water-wise in general. In the past, I've really not had to think that much about it. I've been a bit spoiled water-wise here in Ohio. In the past, we typically get enough rain between that and having a deep country well. I just kind of water when I need to and nature takes care of the rest. But like I said, I think we're looking at increased drought in the future and eventually down the line, the possibility of even wells running dry. So for me, Hügelkultur is a good first step in working toward that more water efficient garden. So what I really like about Hügelkultur in that regard is that the big logs and branches that you place at the bottom of your Hügelkultur bed really do a great job of soaking up any excess water there is. So typically in the spring, we do get a lot of rain. We kind of don't need it then, but we often get excessive rains in the early spring before the garden is even planted. So what I've seen in my other Hügelkultur beds is that those big logs soak up all that water and hold on to it till later in the season when the soil is very dry. At that point, they have the ability to wick the water out into the soil, making it available to my plant roots. I've really been floored by the performance of my existing Hügelkultur beds in this regard. So with my two big beds that I have now, I've not had to water them at all, even this season in these drought conditions. And I've been able to grow both perennial crops and annual crops in those beds, and they've done really, really well. So like I said, my plan is to work on converting more of my garden beds to this Hügelkultur style. I'm focusing on the beds in the back of the garden here, places where it's harder to reach with the hose or more challenging for me to carry out buckets of water from my rain collection system, so that these may become areas where I don't have to worry about providing supplemental irrigation at all. Now, obviously, if we don't get those spring rains or we do have even more drought conditions in the future, this isn't going to be an end-all, beat-all strategy, but it is, I feel, a good first step. Now, as you can imagine, digging right now with as dry as my clay-based soil is very challenging. I'm hoping that eventually we might get rain again and this won't be such an issue. But for the meantime, I'm just coming out and digging a little bit each day. My goal is to make this at least 3 to 4 feet deep and then be able to fill it up through the winter months. Some big bullhorn type peppers here. Again, these have gotten very little water, but thanks to my deep mulch, they haven't suffered too terribly. The fruit does seem to be slightly smaller this year, but I grow this variety every season without complaint. This one is Gurney's Triple Delight. I can show you here, this is what the soil looks like where I've done no watering and have no mulch or cover crop in place. It hurts just to look at this. More peppers, some jalapenos and sweet snacking types, and my Greek pepperoncini, which, as I mentioned in an earlier video, do seem to be prone to blossom end rot. But other than that, they've been fantastically productive. I definitely only needed one plant. Pepper production in general kind of stalled out on me because peppers typically abort or will not set new fruit when temps are consistently above 90 Fahrenheit. But I've still got a healthy amount of fruit that will be harvestable. And up here, all of my fall brassicas, broccoli, cabbage, collards, kohlrabi, and some lettuce as well. I do have a soaker hose set up in these beds. It was an absolute necessity to get these poor transplants established in 90-degree weather with no rain. I've kept these under shade cloth pretty much every day since they've been planted. I take the cloth off around dusk and I put it back on around noon each day. All that white stuff you see in there is diatomaceous earth that I've sprinkled around for slugs. Since this is the only somewhat damp and cool place in the garden, you can imagine how they've flocked here. But overall, these crops are doing surprisingly well right now. One of my all-time favorite summer squash varieties here, this is Smooth Criminal Summer Squash, and this was a later planting. I planted this from seed on July 4th. And it has just given me amazing production here later in the season. It's an indeterminate variety, so it's great for training up a stake, which I failed to do, but you can see how it keeps on putting production up this main leader. And my favorite part, this is an absolutely smooth, spineless type, so it doesn't irritate the heck out of my skin if I try to go in and pick this one with bare arms, like some of the other summer squash and zucchini tend to do. Kohlrabi and lettuce back here. And another planting of shell beans that I need to harvest. This one is Vivid Spirals Grex. I grew this and the other landrace up front, the Vaquitas Grex, this year, and I'm definitely preferring this mix. Amazingly, it seems like I'm going to end up with a decent pumpkin and winter squash harvest this year, even though I predicted untimely death by insect early on in the season. Fruit is trending a bit smaller than normal due to the drought, but I'm not complaining. Here I've got butterkin, butterscotch, and an unnamed trial variety. I've yet to taste any of these, but I have high hopes. And my lunch lady gourds kind of took over this side of the garden. I love all these weird warty variations. Now this behind me is a brand new experience for me in gardening. This is a late planted tomato, specifically the variety Ruby Dawn. It was one of the seedlings from my tomato seedling fertilizer trial that I did a couple of months ago. And this is the first time ever that I have done a late tomato planting and not had the plants completely covered with all of these fun bacterial and fungal diseases that we typically get here in Ohio. Things like septoria leaf spot, late blight, anthracnose. There's just, the list goes on and on. Typically by September, tomatoes look brown and crispy and yellow and they're dying back. There's a few spots on this plant, but for the most part, it is still green and beautiful and healthy. I am chalking this up not only to the drought, but to the fact that the humidity levels have been so unusually low for Ohio. Typically here in late summer, the air is like walking into a solid wall of humidity. It's frankly miserable. I know that some of you in the South can relate very much to this, but those high humidity levels are what contribute to the rampant spread of some of these tomato diseases. Between no rain and very low humidity, these tomatoes have managed to stay incredibly clean. Now, I don't necessarily expect this to be repeated at any season in the near future, but it was a fun experience for me to see what it's like to grow things like tomatoes in essentially a different climate for once. Brussels sprouts are in this homemade netting tent. They outgrew my typical row covers, so I had to innovate a little bit. This is a new to me butternut variety I'm trying out called Zai, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I chose to grow it because the marketing said it was selected specifically for resistance to downy mildew and to tolerate variable and unpredictable climatic conditions. I'll say it definitely lived up to the variable climatic conditions part. These plants look a little rough here, but you can see over there how beautiful and healthy and green these plants look. And they are extremely productive. Definitely a rampant vine though. I keep finding them everywhere. Back here, my one lone castor bean that wasn't toppled in the strong storms we had earlier this year. And I'm doing a lot of cleanup back here. It's gotten to where I can't even walk through anymore. More gourds with some powdery mildew setting in, but at this point in the season, I'm not worried about it. My sweet repeat black raspberries have been producing over the last month. It's a double cropping variety. And this, I have to show you this because I'm baffled by this plant. This vine was absolutely taking over the garden earlier. Some of it's died back by now. But all I can figure is that these sprouted up from the seeds dropped by last year's loofah gourds that I didn't get harvested. They've obviously crossed with another cucurbit because the only fruit that they put on are these weird little Velcro-y seed pods with little hairs that detach and stick to everything. They have very small conspicuous blooms, and I would have just pulled these all up till I saw how many insects were absolutely swarming to these plants. Bees and wasps and pollinating flies of all types. It was wild. Then just a few weeks ago, I started finding assassin bugs in swarms on these plants. Assassin bugs, if you're not familiar, are predatory insects. So they're generally good to have in the garden because they will eat some of those garden pests. But they are generalist predators. So given the chance, they'll eat some of the insects that we consider the good guys too. They're also capable of inflicting humans with a nasty stab from their proboscis. So I generally avoid touching them. But I do find they do more good than harm in my garden, so I'm happy to have them. That being said, I've seen a few of them around through the years, but I've never seen so many as I've seen the last couple of weeks in my garden. And they do tend to favor this plant. So anyway, I'm curious if anyone else has had a vine like this pop up in their gardens. Through here, I've got more gourds. These are tobacco box gourds. And this leads to a Hügelkultur bed where I had my pumpkins planted earlier. They've already been harvested and the vines cleared. Except I missed this one. And here's an assassin bug. But my apricot and necticot trees seem to be thriving in here. I stuck them in here just to protect them from deer last winter, but I think here they will stay. Towards the very back now. Not even October yet, and you can see these trees are changing color. In the back garden, I had my white pumpkin patch. I just finished harvesting these a few days ago. Corn was harvested over a month ago, and potatoes gave way to a few volunteer squash. I'll plant winter rye back here if it ever rains again. Now, something I wanted to show you. See this little cove back here? This is where I keep my piles of leaf mulch in the fall. I had all kinds of volunteer winter squash pop up here, and they are by far the healthiest of any I had planted. Part of this, of course, is the richness, nutrients, and microbial soil life offered by that leaf mold. But what I found so striking is that this spot gets so much less direct sunlight than the exposure in my garden. Maybe 4 hours at most. But these plants are thriving. It's caused me to rethink the planting and placement of my squash and pumpkins. Next year, I'm going to look for other areas that resemble this rather than planting in my garden. So how is garden cleanup for the fall and prep for next spring going to be different in my garden as compared to years past? Well, first of all, because I've cleaned out a lot of my summer crops already and planted fewer fall crops overall because of the drought, I've got less cleanup to do. I've also got more open bed space through the entire garden. But while I may have fewer crops to clean up in the garden, right now is a great time to tackle the cleanup of some of those obnoxious perennial and self-seeding annual weeds. Pulling up thistles and grasses, solarizing any large weedy patches, hitting them now when their reserves are so taxed in this drought is a great way to ensure that they won't have the vigor to come back next spring. But my big focus right now is boosting soil health going into next spring. Now, soil health is always the big issue on my mind, but of particular importance right now, and that is because these drought conditions can be very taxing on the soil microbiome. So I'm focusing on things that are going to revive my soil before the spring season next year starts. Now, one of those things that can boost soil health are cover crops. Normally this time of year, I would have a lot of cover crop planted already. I have all of these empty bed spaces in the back which could use it, but I typically try to avoid watering cover crops. So I was waiting and waiting and waiting, hoping for a rainfall of some sort, which obviously didn't happen. So I'm almost getting too late in the season for a lot of those fall cover crops. But since I'm running out of time with no rain in sight, in my bed up front, I've broken down and irrigated. I went with a blend of many species, including winter triticale, winter peas, oats, vetch, crimson clover, and more, giving this the best overall chance of something I'm planting being able to survive. Some of these plants may winter kill depending on the severity of the winter we have this year, but some should make it through the winter. Hopefully enough to provide some benefit to the soil. I watered this all in well with a sprinkler and, as I mentioned earlier, covered it with shade cloth in attempts to keep this soil cooler. Later in the season, as late as mid-October, I'll cover remaining beds with a seeding of winter rye cover crop. Anything that doesn't get a cover crop will be topped with a generous helping of leaf mulch within the next month or so. I'm also expecting a big load of sheep manure this fall, so my plan is to top dress as many of the beds as I can with a nice big, about a 4 to 6 inch layer of that sheep manure. Now, I did this in the garden out back last fall, and it worked out really, really well. Now, applying in the fall or early winter and letting that sit through the entire winter and early spring months gives that manure plenty of time to age and mellow out. And by mid to late spring, it's ready to be planted. Now, as always, if you are planning on using any type of ruminant manure, so sheep, cow, horse manure in your garden, make sure that it is from a clean source where the animals have not been put out to pasture or fed hay from any fields that have been sprayed with persistent herbicides, as that can kill your entire garden. But I am hard pressed to believe that there is much anything else that can do as much for soil health as good, clean, properly aged manure can. In the spring then, I will focus on adding finished compost, and I plan to experiment with some homemade microbial brews as well, so stay tuned for that. Now, typically when I clean out my garden in the fall, which I've been doing less and less of, just leaving plants in place through the winter to break down naturally, and that works really well. But I still do some cleanup. And in the past, I've taken all of that plant matter and thrown it in my chicken compost pile, basically a pile in the chicken yard that gives them access to scratching and eating whatever they will. But this year, I will be adding the majority of it to my hybrid Hügelkultur compost trench. And I've mentioned this briefly in other videos, but I find that this technique works really well for me. In this variation of a Hügelkultur bed, instead of using composted organic material as one of the final layers and covering the Hügelkultur bed with soil right away, I dig my trench, fill the bottom with log sticks and branches, and then over the course of usually a full year, sometimes more, I slowly fill the rest of the trench with all of my compostable material. So kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, and at this time of the year, everything I'm cleaning out of the garden. I mentioned the one that I've started digging in the back, but I've also got this one that the boys dug for me in the spring. Most of my big stuff, think sunflower stalks, corn stalks, tomato plants, etc., are getting thrown in here. Next year, I'll cover this back up with soil and it will be ready to plant. I may actually put my pumpkins here next year. Now, another aspect of garden cleanup that's happening right now is seed saving. I mentioned collecting bean seed earlier, but I'm also taking advantage of this dry weather to collect a lot of flower seeds. I've saved the heads of my Food Not Lawns poppy mix, which I'll sprinkle out in the late winter, early spring next year. And most of the other flowers I plant are super easy to save seeds from. Just like the beans, I wait till they're dry and just pop them in a mason jar. The nice thing with the flowers is I typically only have one type from each species planted, so I don't have the cross-pollination issues I would have with my veggies. That's another reason that beans and peas too are a great seed to save for beginners. Cross-pollination is fairly rare and you really only have to separate varieties by 10 to 20 feet to avoid any type of cross-pollination. Well, I've got a lot of work to do, so I'm going to get back to it. But I'd love to hear from you. Are you gardening in an area that was affected by the drought? And if so, are you changing up your gardening strategies because of it? I also wanted to offer a word of encouragement in closing. If you are new to gardening and this is your first year, maybe even second or third year, please don't get discouraged and give up. There are always years that are better and worse than others, and I'd say this was probably one of the worst ones. So if you made it through this year, next year might be better. If not, I'm sure that you, like I, have learned some really important lessons to improve your gardening experience going forward. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.